and a woman with nice big bags of eyes for my head.
I never knew this character until today, but I love him. Hello everybody, and welcome to what is essentially my first dive into Crash Bandicoot lore. Now, I do know a little bit about Crash Bandicoot. I have this very distant memory of me playing a Crash Bandicoot game on my PlayStation 2. I don't remember which one it was. All I can remember is just me running through like this 3D environment, which was an amusement park. That's all I've got for you. But we've checked out a few videos from this channel Designing For, who you should definitely go and support. Link to the OG videos at the very top of the description, as always. And a lot of you guys recommended I check out this particular video on Dr. Cortex, who appears to be also a mad scientist. But considering the title of the episode is Designing for Pity, I don't really see him being a very competent villain. Or maybe he is, but Crash Bandicoot is just built different. I don't know. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get right into it.
Video game villains are awesome. They immediately endear themselves to the player as tough challenges to overcome, strike at the hearts of players by messing with a narrative they're directly invested in, and often come to
Okay, I've never played a Final Fantasy game before, but even I know about that moment with Sephiroth. There's like way too many memes to not know about it.
define a game or series as much as their protagonist. A great game can often be made legendary by a great villain, as they become the perfect rival for a player to surpass, or symbolic obstacle to surmount, to prove wrong. They can be terrifying, funny, monstrous, sympathetic, and everything in between. But what happens when you take this antagonist, this final goal, this crux that could hold the game together,
What is a man?
and you make them pitiful?
What? What is that? Oh god, get it off my screen.
There are plenty of villains out there that aren't the pinnacle of intimidation. Final Fantasy's Gilgamesh and Sly Cooper's Dimitri are bumbling fools made to make you laugh more than provide actual threats. Imposing figures like Mass Effect's Elusive Man and Bioshock's Andrew Ryan never receive a boss fight that matches their stature, in spite of their excellent presence and performances. Baddies like Oliver and Don Corneo are such scum that getting to beat them up or stick it to them feels good in spite of their pathetic resistance. Fiends like Bowser, Eggman, and Dr. Nefarious constantly, desperately attempt to correct past failures. There are even truly feeble enemies like Glass Joe or Ozzy, who pretty much exist to lose and be made fun of. Pity is something that many villains do naturally and engender in their own unique ways.
I think it's important to recognize that, just like with main characters, there are many different types of villains. When it comes to narrative storytelling, there may be certain moments in your story that requires a particular type of villain to match whatever you're going for. For the most part, the main constant seems to be the main character. So that's usually the deciding factor as to what type of villain you should have for your series. Of course, this might change if you have multiple villains, but I think any good writer can pretty easily identify what they need for their story. With what I know of Crash Bandicoot, he doesn't really seem like the serious type. In fact, he seems a little bit silly. So if you had a villain like, say, Ganondorf match up against Crash Bandicoot, I'm gonna assume that's just his name. I don't think it would fit very well. You could have some like running gag with this juxtaposition between the super serious villain versus the sillier protagonist, but I think that's kind of hard to do, and there's a lot of pitfalls with that. I'm really intrigued to see how they've implemented Dr. Cortex though into the Crash Bandicoot series.
But one of them weaponizes it. He's the main antagonist of his franchise, arguably hasn't had a boss fight better than decent until recently, and in his nearly 25-year career has never scored anything close to what could be considered a win. And yet, he's one of the most defining elements of his series, managing to be the glue that keeps it together in a different, more subtle way than just a final challenge. He's someone you look forward to seeing no matter how many times he ends up in the dirt. The lovable and eternal loser, Crash Bandicoot's Dr. Neo Cortex.
I'm sorry. This is the part where I'm supposed to be angry.
What? Okay.
Cortex is in a fascinating place because he lacks most of the tools that make video game villains great. He's never really a fight you look forward to, lacking the novelty of seeing one of fellow Doctors Eggman or Wily's newest inventions, or the challenge of nefarious Ripto or K-Rool. The character has been bumbling for so long that he lacks the presence of Liquid Snake, GLaDOS, or Sephiroth.
I was gonna say, yeah. I don't think he's gonna be showing up into the fighting arena with Sephiroth's theme playing. It really doesn't fit his character design. But now I'm actually really curious as to how we implement him and why he's such an important character to the series. Is he beloved by the fans? I would presume so, as he's been a staple for this entire time. And all the other examples that Designing 4 gave for all the sillier villains have been from games that I've never played before. So I don't really have any experience handling this type of villain, or more accurately, like how writers put them into their stories.
His power doesn't really increase during the course of a game to provide excitement. Crash Bandicoot himself isn't a deep enough character for Cortex to stand in any meaningful ideological opposition to him, and the biggest—
Well, there you go. That's the reason why we have to have this type of villain. It's because Mr. Bandicoot over here is kind of just, what? Actually, what is he? I can't tell. So I don't think there's going to be a moment where the villain says, "We're not so different, you and I." Because I have a feeling Bandicoot is just going to scratch his head and be like, "What?" I don't know. I don't understand anything you're saying.
Twist he pulls is secretly being evil when he just tells Crash, No, I promise. I'm good. For realsies. The only thing Cortex seemingly has to cling on to are excellent voice acting performances by Clancy Brown and Lex Lang, and iconography as being the antagonist to the PlayStation's de facto mascot. You'd think the guy would be as irrelevant in the modern day as the Pac-Man ghosts, and even they have something interesting to talk about with their AI patterns.
Wait,
but Cortex
what? Really? I never knew that about the Pac-Man ghosts.
Chooses to endure elsewhere, away from these common trappings. In spite of his shortcomings, he's an intensely likable villain, one that just feels right as the series' antagonist. His relationship with the player is just as personal as any other baddie, but he achieves it through totally different means. Cortex is pathetic. Cortex is tired of all of this. And Cortex is perfectly reflective of the Crash Bandicoot franchise.
Yeah. You have to match the energy. If this villain didn't fit the series, then there's no way they would have kept him for however many years he's been here. 25 plus years?
At any point in time, one only needs to look at the treatment of Neo Cortex to know the feelings of the developers toward the franchise, the ambitions they had, and how they intended to communicate them with the players. And it's this reflective ambition, this pitiful communication, that makes Cortex so great, in his own pathetic way.
Advantage, Cortex.
Neo Periwinkle Cortex was born in Perona, Illinois, to a family of circus clowns. While the world around him was bright, cheerful, and based around making others laugh, Cortex was a recluse, preferring to read books on scientific progress. He was relentlessly teased for this, and at the age of 3, a group of particularly evil clown/family members tattooed the letter N on his forehead.
How dare they? No! Oh my god. No, Dr. Neo Cortex. I wonder if he understood what it meant, he probably did. So did he like adapt it into something more positive for himself? That because this is a symbol that you use to make fun of me, I will use it to conquer the world, in kind of a similar way to Dr. Eggman, which I think he called himself Dr. Eggman because Sonic made fun of him by calling him that.
A freak accident then followed, the entire circus blowing up mysteriously. Only
Freak accident. Yeah, right.
Cortex surviving. After
Totally.
a brief stint at Madame Amberly's Academy of Evil, Cortex entered high school at the age of 8 with his colleague, Nitrous Brio. A freak accident then followed, the entire high school and most of the surrounding town blowing up mysteriously.
Oh, no.
Cortex and Brio surviving by coincidentally hiding in an abandoned plutonium mine. The two used the moment to launch their careers as evil scientists, eventually fleeing to the security of the Insanity Islands.
I would like to know where you can sign up to become an evil mad scientist. The only way I was able to discover this path was by becoming a VTuber, but I don't really feel all that evil just yet.
The coast of Australia to mutate and brainwash the local wildlife and take over the world.
Oh wait, the local wildlife in Australia, does that mean Crash Bandicoot was created by Neo? What was Crash initially? A kangaroo? It doesn't really look like one. Yeah.
As you can see, Cortex has been a joke from day one. His plans aren't great, his backstory is as silly as it gets, and he basically embodies the prototypical idea of a nerd revenge fantasy. Even his actual role in Crash 1 is kinda pathetic. While Embryo builds the Evolvo Ray that grants the mad scientist duo an army of mutant animals,
which I invented. Me, not Cortex. Read your Bible, I wrote it.
Cortex's contribution is the Cortex Vortex, a machine built to brainwash those animals into absolute loyalty. This machine's failure is the entire reason that Crash Bandicoot, meant to be the general of Cortex's army but rejected by the Vortex, becomes a thorn in Cortex's side.
Gotcha.
Cortex literally builds his arch enemy and foil out of nothing but impatience and failure. And that even carries over into his boss fight. By the time Cortex actually faces off with Crash, the Bandicoot has wrecked his army, destroyed his lab, stolen his valuables, set his entire castle on fire, and hijacked his escape zeppelin. Sure, Cortex can shoot lasers at Crash in what's both likely and sadly the best boss fight the Doctor will get for 2 decades, but he's lost before he's even started. He's a conventional cartoon villain made to take the fall at the end of the game.
Yeah.
He's worthless. He's perfect for...
So it's the Saturday night cartoon villain archetype, which it works, but you have to go the full length. You can't half-ass this. And I think the Crash series does him quite well in that aspect because he's remained so consistent throughout the years. This is kind of exactly what they needed, and it worked, so there's no need to fix it.
Crash Bandicoot. At the time of its release, Crash Bandicoot was just the 3rd console game developer Naughty Dog had made.
Wait, this was a game developed by Naughty Dog? What? Okay, I didn't know that. Dang.
It's an ambitious idea. A cartoon brought to life with the power of polygons and expressive illustrations. Trying to introduce a new camera perspective that hadn't much been seen in platformers to this point, and make it not only work, but make it fun and good. Cortex, by contrast, was everything that could go wrong. Egotism and ambition leading to short-sightedness, traditional conventions not working out in a new direction, the looming shadow of the real-life Big N overwhelming Crash in the 3D platformer space. Cortex is a villain of insecurity, intentionally or no.
Failure again.
But players discovered that the road to that encounter was paved with far greater obstacles than the showdown itself. Crash Bandicoot succeeds in defeating Dr. Neo Cortex and saving furry Pamela Anderson.
Oh my.
Crash Bandicoot succeeded as
Was this the furry awakening for a lot of young children? I could see it. And hey, I'm not gonna judge.
a game and became the face of the PlayStation in spite of competing directly with the behemoth Super Mario 64. And players who got through the occasionally brutal platforming of Crash were rewarded with a victory lap against the Mad Doctor to end their adventure.
I have heard that people have described Crash Bandicoot as the Dark Souls of platformers. Granted, that description it's kind of boring because so many people just use that for any game that's difficult. But it does give me a pretty good idea that this ain't like your average platformer.
Cortex was pathetic, but he was the fate that Crash escaped from, with nothing but a stupid grin, ambition, and a lot of platforming and programming expertise. As much as we need big, imposing bad guys and climactic final showdowns, sometimes you can just kick a sad clown to feel better about yourself. And that's neat. After the incredible success of the original Crash Bandicoot, the question became, what next? Not just for the franchise, but for Cortex as well. He'd gotten a little tease that he might return in Crash 1's ending, but his purpose had pretty much been fulfilled. Serve as a foil to Crash's hip counterculture personality, get beaten up, take a paycheck. Other elements of Crash were being replaced. Crash's buxom girlfriend Tawna being swapped out for his smarter, far less problematic sister Coco being a big one. So what
No! How could this be? They took away Crash's girlfriend. Fuck. I didn't even play the games and now I'm sad.
What would Cortex do in order to adapt? Well, he became a lot more of a character.
Well, well, well. If it isn't Crash Bandicoot, welcome.
The way Cortex interacts with the Bandicoot through Crash 2 is almost GLaDOS-esque. Trying to trick the moronic marsupial into collecting a bunch of mind control crystals for him so he can use a big mind control laser, saying it's for the greater good to stop the planets from aligning or something.
And Crash falls for it because he's dumb enough to fall for it. Oh, that's so perfect. It's such a perfect villain. Because if you had somebody that was actually competent, then Crash would probably get completely screwed over. But instead, we just get to have fun with it. And maybe it's just me, but maybe in an alternate reality, I would have loved to voice Dr. Neo Cortex. It sounds like so much fun.
Clancy Brown was brought on to voice the Doctor, and so much personality is delivered in his dark, intimidating tones. From explosive anger to self-assured arrogance to comedic, calming nervousness.
Ingenue fool! She's telling him everything! Ah, yes. We're
Oh, yeah.
And that's the real kicker of Crash 2. The player knows that Cortex is using Crash from the start, and it doesn't even matter. Cortex can have as much bluster as he'd like. He's still gonna lose to a goofball spinning into him a couple times. The player can even mess with Cortex, purposefully avoiding the crystals Cortex craves in levels, leading to 3 unique cutscenes where Cortex loses his temper more and more because the player won't
bring me crystals.
Heck, Cortex doesn't even fight the player in this game. The final showdown just consisting of Cortex desperately trying to run away while Crash chases
Mikolash, is that you?
him down and spins into him 3 times in one of the most hilariously bad boss encounters in a 3D platformer. Cortex's Wizard of Oz routine just leads to a growing desire for the player to show him up. And when he tries to put up whatever pitiful resistance he can offer, he's easily brushed aside like it's nothing. It was the closest analog players had to the tone and style of playable Looney Tunes, being the Roadrunner outwitting the overly complex traps of the far more refined and intelligent Wile E. Coyote. And Cortex was there to perfectly take the fall once again.
You haven't seen the last of me, Crash Bandicoot!
But for Crash 3, something interesting happened to Cortex. 2 new villains were introduced. The significantly more competent Dr. Nefarious Tropy, and the significantly more evil and powerful Uka Uka.
No, it cannot be.
Cortex may still be the face of the operation, but he was no longer the brains nor the brawn behind it.
It does make sense at this point in the series to introduce more villains. Need some variety. It can't just be Dr. Neo, but he still has to be there. He's just way too iconic. And also makes sense that one's more competent and the other's more evil. The things that Neo is sort of lacking in.
And through his obsolescence, Cortex became tired. He acknowledges his past failures, practically seems to whine when he sees, "Oh boy, here's Crash to foil my plans again." Gives
Not
a
again.
pitiful eulogy when you beat the first boss.
Tiny was a good fellow. He hated everyone and everything, but a good heart nonetheless.
The closer you get to his eventual showdown, the more resigned and sad he becomes, knowing that the inevitable is coming, and just putting up a slight resistance on the very slim chance he might win.
Bro, I love how, comparatively to the other villains that we've taken a look at, like, say, Bowser or Eggman, they are ready to fight their main protagonist. In fact, whenever a clash happens between them, they're downright excited for it. But when it comes to Dr. Neo here, it's almost like Crash is just running around bullying him. He's just, please, stop. No more.
And after one more boss fight where he basically just sits around and takes pot shots while hoping Uka Uka does the work for him,
Defeated again! This is not fair! Maybe I should retire to a nice big beach with nice big drink and a woman with nice big bags of eyes for my head.
I know what you're gonna say there. Nice save, but hey, I respect it. Also, whoever writes the dialogue for Dr. Neo is freaking genius. I never knew this character until today, but I love him.
and Cortex's words would become prophetic. Crash 3 had a turnaround of roughly 9 months, and through that intense period, Naughty Dog had taken the Bandicoot as far as they could or wanted, struggling to think of new ways to expand the series while staying true to Crash's roots. The devs were tired, Cortex was tired, and players could almost find sympathy in this exhausted idiot they bullied for 3 years straight. Naughty Dog would go on to invent the greatest racing game ever made, but after that, the developer would part ways with the Crash Bandicoot series, leaving the future of the optimistic spinster and the exhausted doctor in question. And questionable would become the word to define the Crash Bandicoot series for nearly the next 2 decades. The Crash IP would be peddled out to various companies who would take a stab at their own interpretation, to mixed but generally middling results, or would turn into minigame collections meant to make a quick buck and then burn out dismally. Crash went from a gaming superstar to a has-been in just a scant few years.
What happened? We just ran out of ideas? Aw, that's unfortunate, but I guess it happens. It's just sad, though, to see something that stood up to the likes of Mario kind of fall to this level. But there has to be some sort of revival, right? Because I do know that the series is still quite popular even today.
Naughty Dog co-founder Evan Wells famously being quoted saying, "It's a little bit like watching your daughter do porn."
What the fuck? You know, I don't think that's even inaccurate.
I guess you didn't have what it takes, Crash.
Jesus, man.
Crash became a pitiful series, and strangely, it'd be Dr. Cortex that rose to the occasion. Through these uncertain years of experimentation, cash grabs, and shifting direction, the uncertain experimental villain ended up being a reflection of each game, through its strengths and weaknesses. Wrath of Cortex features the Doctor trying to prepare a super weapon in secret, but being pressured by Uka Uka to reveal his hand early, while at the same time developer Traveler's Tales was being forced to retool their efforts from an innovative free-roaming puzzle platforming Crash title to a standard Crash adventure for next-gen hardware with a deadline of just 12 months. The game had a few good levels, did the best it could, and introduced the excellent character of Crunch Bandicoot.
So pretty, I could kiss myself.
But was a ploddingly standard affair otherwise, the gameplay feeling just as tired and jerked around as Cortex himself.
Crash Bandicoot, my old nemesis. How the heck are you? Still gathering crystals? Old habits die hard, don't they?
In Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure, Dr. Cortex actually succeeds in shrinking the entire Earth to fit in the palm of his hand. And then does nothing for the whole game as a pint-sized Crash not only overwhelms him, but turns him into a chimeric abomination and blows him up. It was a valiant effort to shrink Crash down onto the GBA, and a pretty decent little platformer all in all, but ultimately was a hodgepodge of ideas and assets from the series. It's portable now. Now what? He showed up in Skylanders to get punked by Fake Crash, a cameo-centric joke character based off of bootleg Japanese Crash merch. Yeah. Crash of the Titans actually purposely sidelines Cortex, letting him be his over-the-top comedic self for the first boss fight before ditching him almost entirely, boldly declaring that no, we're doing things different this time and taking the series in our own direction. It wasn't great, but it was an attempt.
It was an attempt,
and reinvigorating for the team at Radical Entertainment.
You were a skank! I'm just so proud of you right now.
And you can feel that newfound passion throughout Crash Mind Over Mutant. Every single cutscene animated in a different style, Cortex coming up with a much more clever application of his usual hypnosis scheme that actually seems to work for once, the acting becoming more over the top, the Doctor front and center whenever possible, and hamming it up gleefully in his first bout of true confidence in a long, long time. Only to be completely shattered by the end of the game. All talk, no big payoff. But hey, the ride was nice.
That's who he is.
I want to win! It's my turn! Been trying for flipping years!
But the biggest talking point, and the Doctor's most memorable and beloved performance during this time, was 2004's Crash Twinsanity. This title would give Cortex nearly equal billing to Crash, appearing as the game's
This was the one I played. I recognize this.
First boss before effectively being tied to the Bandicoot at the hip. Getting flung around, beat up, used as a weapon, used as a snowboard, and generally being humiliated by Crash in every which way for the sake of a fun platformer. A focus on Cortex specifically was developed here, wanting to explore the Doctor's character further than just as a punching bag. Lex Lang would become Cortex's new voice after Clancy Brown declined the role. And he brought a manic, insecure energy to the role, heavily inspired by Monty Python's Flying Circus, that would cement Cortex as both a brilliant comedy character and as an absolute loser.
Damn. Yikes, bro. I feel as if this is a similar situation to the Mario RPG, where it substantially expands upon the characters and therefore makes them more significant in our minds. Here we do so by changing the perspective a little bit. We're not necessarily fighting against him, but working together.
You require 6 power crystals in order to make the leap, and we have 4. Let's see.
Did you have to count on your fingers?
That isn't enough!
Cortex is everything the game wants to be, constantly inventing new gameplay scenarios through his antics, bringing in fun new characters with Nina Cortex and the evil twins as a result of his bumbling, constantly giving a slightly manic edge to every encounter with any other member of the cast. Is the game itself an unfinished mess that has tons of levels and ideas cut, desperately trying to cobble itself together out of gags and dreams?
Come now, as we explore a new dimension! It should have been 2 new dimensions, but we ran out of time.
Sure.
Yikes.
But not only is the game, and by extent Cortex in its spotlight role, doing absolutely everything it can to be a fun and memorable time, but it's very on.
What is that? Oh, poor Crash, man. Also, poor Dr. Neo. This is such an abusive and toxic relationship. And I love seeing every second of it.
Honest about not only the choppy, almost amateurish presentation at times, but of the state of the Crash franchise as a whole.
The check bounced. Are you sure?
Oh.
Well, the past few years have kind of been slow. Wrath of Cortex didn't do as well as we'd hoped, and...
Aww.
Fish?
Those penguins are really mad.
Crash Bandicoot didn't have very many great games for a very long time, but it was still a great franchise in some weird way. Almost every Crash game tried to do something new, and maybe it was too ambitious, maybe studios meddled, maybe the deadline was way too tight, but something always shone out of those batches of mediocrity. And every single time, it'd be pitiful old Dr. Cortex bringing that ambition to the forefront. If a Crash game's gameplay isn't great, the character of Crash Bandicoot, stupidly grinning through adversity to overcome the odds, doesn't work, plain and simple. But Cortex was always more than that. Cortex tried, added character, brought in new ideas, was emblematic of all the excitement and frustration and doubt that the teams that handled him had during the dark days on Insanity Island. And that's weird to say, that a villain being pathetic and used as a comedy prop carried the series. But he gave Crash solid ground to stand on while the gaming landscape and what it meant to be Crash Bandicoot in that landscape changed around him. Cortex was always a sign that we're still here, we're still trying, and thank you for still being a Crash Bandicoot fan.
Damn. It is kind of funny in a way with how much the history of the Crash Bandicoot series and how it was handled later on perfectly mirrors Dr. Neo as a character. We are moving into another section of the video, however, so hopefully I suspect that there's going to be some good Crash games that came out recently. I haven't been following any of that news because this wasn't really a franchise I was into, but you can see so much potential from each and every game. Well, maybe not every single game, but there are aspects of them that work. It's just everything surrounding them don't really help that. This is unfortunately true for so many other game series as well that never really picked up or have sort of deteriorated over the course of time.
And when Crash finally did come back, after years of hibernation, there was only one gleeful voice that could ring in his return.
Developed by vicarious visions. It's Crash Bandicoot!
Insane
In one
trilogy.
fell swoop, Crash Bandicoot, the Insane Trilogy, catapulted the series back into the spotlight. Vicarious Visions reconstructed the 3 classic titles from the ground up, introducing these levels, characters, and that ever so delightful feeling of kicking Cortex when he's down to a new generation. Crash was back, and after recreating the greatest racing game of all time, looking to keep his momentum and keep the series fresh and interesting. And as usual, when new ambitions come a-knockin', Cortex is there to answer.
Crash Bandicoot! It's about time!
Looks good too.
Crash 4 sets out to be a sort of alternate timeline to Crash Bandicoot, serving as a direct sequel to Crash 3, where Cortex, Uka Uka, and Entropy were simply caught in time jail for 20 years. And from the moment the game starts, Cortex is just as pitiful as ever, beating up on a Crash training dummy with a stick, while the far more competent villains attempt an escape that Cortex has already resigned himself to believing will never work. And even when it does work, Cortex is dejected, dismissing plans from his fellow evil scientists and just toiling away at menial mechanical tasks. This is a Cortex that never stopped being tired, a Cortex that never developed after Crash 3, a Cortex trapped in the past. The only thing that keeps him going is his egocentric nature and his hatred for Crash Bandicoot, only ever really showing excitement when the prospect of finally one-upping his nemesis shows itself. And when even that fails, in the middle of the game no less, not even a final boss fight like usual, Cortex completely breaks down.
No.
He knows he's pathetic. He knows it's all futile, and he can't take it anymore.
Must we keep going around and around like this? Tell me, Crash, is this all there is? Forever?
Oh, I don't know, man.
Coming into Crash 4, developers Toys for Bob were faced with a unique problem. Crash Bandicoot was back in the spotlight, but only off of the strength of his classic titles from the Naughty Dog era.
You gotta do something new.
They're still excellent games, and the insane remake of Crash 3 is also pretty alright. But they sold off of overwhelming nostalgia after nearly 9 years without a mainline Crash Bandicoot game, and over 15 since the last Crash game in the style of the originals.
We're Crash Bandicoot fans, man. If there were still any during that period, I guess just play the old games. I want to say, though, that Dr. Dio is kind of real for that monologue there. The clash between the hero and the villain is kind of unceasing. It's a never-ending loop. We just see it in a different flavor every single time, just like we do with Mario. But Neo's kind of self-aware, perhaps even a little too self-aware, to the point where he doesn't attempt to become more competent. He kind of just accepts that that's his lot in life, to lose to Crash every single time. It's sad, but also unfortunately relatable. Sometimes you just feel like there's nothing you can do. So like, why even try?
The question was posed not only by players, but also Naughty Dog co-founder Jason Rubin. Can you make Crash Bandicoot relevant beyond the nostalgia? Is Crash Bandicoot a tired series based in the past, needing to churn out similar sequels every so often to stay relevant? Is it even possible to take the series, founded on innovations at the start of 3D platforming and strong but ultimately basic fundamentals, in a new direction, without losing the core of what made it so special and addicting? Well, history tends to repeat itself. Doubts and anxieties arose, and like clockwork, those same feelings found themselves at the crux of Cortex's character. Cortex's entire arc in It's About Time is focused on ending the endless cycle between him and Crash, about finding something new, breaking his string of countless failures. And he does everything in his power to fight back against that inevitable cycle.
Man, Okay, so it's not just coincidence then. It has to be. I know this is what Designing 4 is arguing for, that Dr. Neo's role within the story is a representation of the frustration of the developers and like what the current state of the games are in. And I mean, there was that literal meta dialogue in a previous game where they were talking about the checks not passing. But I genuinely wonder if that's a philosophy behind his characterization, that he is the embodiment of the developers. Although we're in kind of a unique situation here with Crash being the type of protagonist that he is. You can't really tell the story through him. So the story being told through Neo does make sense.
Cortex becomes a playable character, not as an extension of Crash, but as his own man.
It's like when you got to play as Bowser in one of the Mario games.
Dealing with a new control scheme based around air dashing and turning enemies into platforms. Flashback tapes found throughout the game show his relationship with Crash before the events of the series, viewing himself as a father figure to his test subject Tasmanian, telling secrets to the mindless.
Oh, he's a Tasmanian devil. Okay, there you go. I wondered what he was.
Marsupial as he hops around crates, feeling betrayed when Crash rejected the Cortex Vortex. He even joins Crash's team to beat up Entropy for daring to insinuate he was useless. Cortex's egotism driving him to an odd place of heroism. Cortex goes the extra mile to defy the conventions of his character, to make himself not just pathetic, but sympathetic. To finally get a happy ending that players, after decades of having Cortex endear himself to them through slapstick and failed efforts, might hopefully want for him. And he just can't help himself. The final act of It's About Time features Cortex kidnapping the mystical temporal masks.
Look, okay, I would much prefer Cortex be the villain than anybody else. Because at least then you know whatever thing he's got planned probably is not going to succeed. And it wouldn't really do too much damage in the first place. As opposed to the other ones that were way too competent and just downright evil.
Forcing them to warp him back to 1996, to Crash 1, to stop himself from ever creating the Bandicoot, to rid himself of his greatest failure once and for all. In the end, Cortex can try something new. Crash as a whole can try something new. But he will always fixate on his original failures. Just as the games will always celebrate what a stunning achievement those original titles were. Cortex Castle is as celebratory and reverent as it is contemporary and fun, featuring some of the hardest platforming in the entire Crash series, remixed with Crash 4's unique mechanics in a way that could only be accomplished with a modern touch. Cortex gets to argue with his past self, thoroughly fed up with the blind, unhinged ambition that originally defined him.
Do you have any idea how stubborn I used to be?
Yes, we do.
And then, the madman actually does it. It took him 24 long years.
A boss
but Cortex finally accomplished what he'd wanted to do for so long. We finally got a good boss fight out of there!
There you go.
So beautiful! Oh, and he loses. Of course he does. It's Cortex. Yeah. Past Cortex goes on to make Crash Bandicoot, a stable time loop ensuring that Cortex's failures will go on to define him across timelines. And the defeated Doctor is banished to the end of time itself as punishment for his crimes. And there, in the endless expanse of the sands of time, Cortex finds peace. He'd failed again, sure, but he proved.
So, he finds peace at the end of time. In a way, you could view that as forced acceptance. There's literally nothing there for you anymore. It's just you. Given some time to self-reflect, he could maybe understand himself a bit more. It's beautiful, but also still really sad. It's so odd, though. As a fellow mad scientist, I feel for this guy. think he's pathetic, but I also kind of respect him because he wants to give up, but he never really did. I mean, if he did give up, then why is he here?
Proved his ambition and gave it his all. He made something to be proud of. And even if he was the same pitiful doctor in the end, he succeeded in breaking the inevitable cycle of squaring off against Crash in the same way over and over again. He's free of Crash and can finally simply be left alone. A sad little end for a sad little man, but one he's perfectly content with. Until the 106% ending changes that, but I wouldn't know about that because I can't even get the Platinum Relic in Offbeat.
Damn. We're not gamer enough to get there.
Typically, you're not gonna want as sorry of a main villain as Neo Cortex.
Yeah,
the bad guys are usually much better off being the intimidating type that you can actually take seriously from a presentational or mechanical perspective. And indeed, when you look at the accomplishments, the presence, the tenacity, the legacy of his antagonistic peers, Cortex seems outclassed in nearly every regard. But Crash Bandicoot isn't your average franchise, and Dr. Cortex refuses to be your average villain to match. It's a long, storied series, one many grew up with, one many discovered during its more troubled times, one that went dormant and made the heart yearn for it, and one that presented many, many challenges for every team that's ever tackled it. Cortex is a testament to all those toils. Every hurdle overcome and stumbled over, every doubt of success that the franchise had, and as an epitaph of the love and care each team had in making a fun, memorable game. You could see nearly 25 years of history in the character's growth and development, and no matter where players first encounter him on that long and winding road, Cortex always gives an effort, in spite of his pathetic tendencies. Failure and humiliation defines every bit of Cortex's design, but it doesn't need to for his devs. It doesn't need to for players, and it doesn't need to for the Crash Bandicoot franchise. Overcoming that, laughing with him, finding a victory lap waiting for you at the end of a long and grueling journey, that's a feeling that only the medium's best can capture. Through a roundabout way that only he could stumble onto, Cortex has made himself a villain to be remembered. One who doesn't use any conventional tools, but endears himself to millions by trying his hardest, by failing, and by designing for pity.
Yes, yes. Hold your applause. Just throw loose change and social security checks.
Oh, that's a nice little tribute to the OG. I never knew that the Crash Bandicoot series was struggling for such a long time. I thought it was pretty big, and it had been something that I had known about, but I somewhat understand the unique situation it was in, with the how innovative the gameplay was, but then struggling to really figure out how we could evolve that from the same formula. To me, at least, it somewhat seems like the Crash Bandicoot characters aren't as flexible as some other characters, some other franchises. But when they're in their element, they work really, really well. Cortex plays perfectly off of Crash, given the context of their games. And it was interesting to see how his character evolved based on the current state of how the games were. Or maybe it's more accurate to say what the games required of him. I never quite seen a villain like him implemented in video games, at least. So I think I'll use this as a good point of reference for any other silly villain I might run into. But yeah, dudes, that's going to be it from me. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope y'all enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one.